Oh, okay.
Was talking about
Lindsey,
these
one
at
of
the
my former
Congress.
colleagues. Yeah. Well, you should ask Lindsey about how he's going to put that together, because, but we just haven't heard it. I'm not saying you may not hear that one day in the future, but I think what is clear, and I think maybe perhaps what Lindsey is speaking to, is that it is clear that if you talk to leaders in the region in all these countries, they all have the same goal, perhaps not, which is to ensure that Hezbollah can no longer play the role that they've played in the past, not just threatening Israel, but being an agent, an open agent, really a proxy of Iranian influence in the region.
Thank you.
We just watched something extraordinary happen right here, right before our eyes. Something that should terrify every single one of us who still believes that American foreign policy should be about keeping us out of endless bloodbaths masquerading as strategic interests. And what we just witnessed was the absolute normalization of perpetual warfare wrapped in diplomatic language so casual, so evasive, so deliberately vague, that it makes your blood run cold when you understand what's actually being telegraphed here. Lindsey Graham has been speaking in Tel Aviv after visiting Lebanon, stating that if Hezbollah does not agree to disarm, it should face military action. And Marco Rubio, our current Secretary of State, just shrugged this off with the kind of studied nonchalance that would be funny if it weren't so catastrophically dangerous, joking about asking Lindsey about how he's going to put that together, while simultaneously refusing to rule it out in the future, all while validating the broader goal of neutralizing Hezbollah as an Iranian proxy. Wait for it, because this gets so much worse than you think. The context here is absolutely explosive, and I want you to understand the timeline we're living through right now, because Graham visited Beirut in late August 2025, advocating for a defense agreement between America and Lebanon, provided the country strengthens its army and curbs the influence of Hezbollah, telling Lebanese officials that if they make an effort to disarm Hezbollah, the U.S. will be there trying to help. And here's where it gets truly sinister in its imperial logic. Graham told Lebanese leaders that Hezbollah's continued presence as an armed group was a wall to growth and integration, warning that as long as Hezbollah kept its weapons, Lebanon's growth, integration with the West, and regional stability would remain limited. This is neo-colonial extortion, dressed up as diplomatic incentives, the kind of thing that would make John Foster Dulles blush with its naked transactionalism, and the terrifying part is how bipartisan this approach has become, with Graham appearing alongside Democrat Senator Jeanne Shaheen and Republican Representative Joe Wilson, asking how many nations have a defense agreement with the United States, and noting that very few nations have America willing to go to war for them. You're watching the architecture of another Middle East quagmire being constructed in real time. And here's the bombshell that should have every anti-war activist, every progressive, every person who remembers Iraq screaming from the rooftops. Graham has stated that if the plan to disarm Hezbollah in Lebanon fails, the U.S. is prepared to resort to hard options including military action. While more recently in December 2025, Graham said if you can't get Hezbollah to disarm diplomatically in Lebanon, the administration should come up with a military campaign to take Hezbollah down and work with Israel to do that. This is not speculation. This is not worst-case scenario planning. This is stated policy preference from one of the most influential senators on foreign policy, someone who sits on the Armed Services Committee and has the ear of both Democratic and Republican administrations when it comes to Middle East interventionism. The machinery of war is being oiled and prepared. Now let's talk about what Rubio represents in this calculus, because understanding his worldview is absolutely essential to grasping where this administration might take us. Marco Rubio's nomination as Secretary of State signaled that the Trump administration would pursue a hardline approach in the Middle East, and Rubio was one of the strongest opponents of the 2015 Iran nuclear deal and supports a policy of maximum economic pressure on Tehran, saying Washington cannot afford to let Iran expand its influence in the region unchecked. This is a man whose entire foreign policy framework is constructed around the neoconservative architecture that gave us the Iraq War, the destabilization of Libya, the forever war in Afghanistan, wrapped in the language of countering Iranian influence as if that's some kind of magic justification for perpetual military engagement. As vice chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Rubio has carved out a reputation as a steadfast proponent of hardline policies, receiving over $1 million from pro-Israel donors and consistently aligning himself with neoconservative hawks. Follow the money and you'll find the warmongering. But wait, there's more, because the progressive critique here needs to extend beyond individual politicians to the systemic imperial logic that undergirds this entire approach. Rubio's record while on Capitol Hill suggests an approach that is likely tough on Iran, supportive of the Gulf states and Israel, and focused on expanding U.S. influence and partnerships in the region. This is empire maintenance masquerading as foreign policy, the kind of strategic thinking that views entire nations as chess pieces to be moved around in service of what gets euphemistically called American interests, but what actually means the projection of military power to maintain hegemonic control over a region rich in natural resources and geopolitically strategic. We've seen this movie before, and it always ends in catastrophe for the people who actually live in these countries. Beirut's clampdown on Hezbollah comes after prodding from U.S. envoy Tom Barrack, who presented the government with detailed proposals featuring a timetable for disarming the group, even as Israel continued to violate a November truce, with phased proposals aiming to extend and stabilize the ceasefire by requiring the government to remove Hezbollah's arsenal under a detailed Lebanese army deployment plan. Think about the profound asymmetry here, the absolute moral bankruptcy of demanding that a sovereign nation disarm a political faction that millions of its citizens support, while one of the most powerful militaries in the world continues to violate ceasefires and occupy Lebanese territory. Israel launched a military offensive in Lebanon in October 2023, which escalated into full-scale war by September 2024, killing more than 4,000 people and injuring around 17,000, and after a ceasefire was reached in November, Israeli forces have conducted near-daily attacks in southern Lebanon. This is the context that gets conveniently erased when American officials talk about neutralizing Hezbollah. And here's where the progressive analysis has to get really sophisticated about proxy warfare and what's actually happening beneath the surface of these diplomatic conversations, because Israel has claimed Hezbollah is rearming, though analysts say the group is not an existential threat to Israel, as the group was badly weakened during last year's war with much of its senior military leadership assassinated, including longtime leader Hassan Nasrallah. The threat is being manufactured, inflated, instrumentalized to justify military action that serves entirely different strategic purposes, and those purposes have everything to do with reshaping the regional order in ways that eliminate resistance to Israeli and American hegemony. Hezbollah was Lebanon's most powerful armed actor, and the destruction of its equipment means the country will be left with few defenses. This is about creating vulnerability, not security. The historical parallel that should be haunting every American right now is Iraq, and I want to be absolutely explicit about this, because the same rhetorical patterns, the same strategic logic, the same bipartisan consensus is emerging around potential military action in Lebanon. Remember how we were told that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, that he was an existential threat, that the Iraqi people would greet us as liberators, that it would be a quick operation to establish democracy, and then remember what actually happened: hundreds of thousands dead, a country destroyed, regional instability that metastasized into ISIS, trillions of dollars wasted, thousands of American service members killed or wounded, and a legacy of torture and war crimes that has permanently damaged America's moral standing in the world. We're watching the prologue to that disaster being rewritten with different proper nouns. The Lebanese government approved a U.S. plan to disarm Hezbollah, the group whose military wing was recognized by previous governments as a parallel security structure to Lebanon's armed forces. But Hezbollah Political Council Deputy Chief Mahmoud Komati called the Lebanese government's decision a march in humiliation and surrender to Israel and the U.S., saying, "There is no state or government in the world that confronts the resistance in its own territory, while the enemy is still there occupying the land and carrying out aggressions against Lebanon daily," adding that Hezbollah would continue to exercise its right to resist Israel under the UN Charter. This is a recipe for civil conflict, for internal Lebanese destabilization, for the kind of sectarian violence that could make Syria's civil war look manageable by comparisons, and American officials are pushing for it anyway, because the strategic goal of eliminating resistance to Israeli regional dominance takes precedence over any concern for Lebanese lives or sovereignty. Let's talk about what Rubio's evasiveness in that clip actually reveals, because the casual dismissal, the little joke about asking Lindsey how he's going to put that together, is precisely how normalized military interventionism becomes, how the Overton window shifts until what should be unthinkable becomes merely one policy option among many. One observer noted that Rubio will be more hawkish on Iran. Rubio called for an intensified air campaign against Yemen, framing Yemen's actions as a direct threat to American and Israeli interests demanding decisive military response, and if he maintains his hardline stance as Secretary of State, his calls for intensified airstrikes and provision of lethal weaponry to Gulf nations as proxies could spark a catastrophic regional war. You're watching the construction of a multi-front Middle East war in real time, folks, and the terrifying thing is how little public debate there is about it. The Iran proxy narrative needs to be interrogated here with real intellectual rigor, Because yes, the State Department says Iran continues to provide Hezbollah with most of its funding, training, weapons, and explosives, as well as political, diplomatic, monetary, and organizational aid. Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah said in 2016 that Hezbollah's budget, everything it eats and drinks, its weapons and rockets, comes from the Islamic Republic of Iran. But here's what gets deliberately obscured in American discourse. Hezbollah is not merely an Iranian puppet. It's a deeply rooted political and social movement in Lebanon, with genuine popular support among the Shia community, providing social services, running hospitals and schools, and representing constituencies that have been historically marginalized in Lebanese politics. In much of Lebanon's post-Civil War period, Hezbollah has been Lebanon's political and military hegemon, with its support coming mostly from the Shia community, and most elected Shia officials being members of Hezbollah, or their allies, the Amal movement. You cannot bomb a political movement out of existence without creating humanitarian catastrophe, and let's address the elephant in the room that American media consistently refuses to acknowledge. Since a ceasefire was agreed on November 27, 2024, Israel has killed more than 300 people, including at least 127 civilians according to the United Nations, and Israel has violated the ceasefire repeatedly while continuing to occupy 5 locations in southern Lebanon. Where is the American pressure on Israel to comply with the ceasefire it signed? Where are the consequences for continued violations? Where is the moral consistency that would suggest this is actually about peace and stability, rather than using Lebanon as another theater for confrontation with Iran? Israel has continued to strike Lebanon, claiming its operations are aimed at preventing Hezbollah from rearming, while Lebanese health officials say around 250 people have been killed and more than 600 wounded in Israeli attacks since the ceasefire. This is impunity. This is the logic of might makes right. This is everything progressives should be mobilizing against. The bipartisan nature of this hawkishness should alarm everyone who thought that changing administrations might bring different approaches to the Middle East, because Graham appeared alongside Democrat Senator Jeanne Shaheen during the Lebanon visit, with both serving on the Senate Appropriations Committee and speaking about their support for supplying U.S. funding for the Lebanese armed forces and Lebanon's financial recovery, while Shaheen called the steps Lebanon's government pledged critical and said lawmakers will continue to press for support through legislation and the appropriations process. This is the national security establishment consensus operating exactly as it's designed to, transcending partisan divisions to maintain imperial foreign policy continuity, regardless of which party controls the White House. The military-industrial complex doesn't care about your election outcomes. Now here's where the analysis needs to get really uncomfortable for liberals who might want to distinguish Trump's foreign policy from what came before, because Rubio is hawkish against all the usual suspects, including China, Iran, Venezuela, and Cuba, and is indifferent toward Gaza and Ukraine, though the only problem from Trump's point of view might be that he's too hawkish. The Trump administration is not anti-interventionist, it's selectively interventionist based on a different set of priorities than the Biden administration, but equally willing to use military force when it serves perceived strategic interests. Rubio has staunchly backed Israel's war in Gaza, telling a peace activist that Hamas was 100% to blame for deaths of Palestinians in the enclave, and saying he wants Israel to destroy every element of Hamas they can get their hands on. This is genocidal logic. This is the erasure of Palestinian humanity. This is the kind of dehumanization that always precedes mass atrocities. The domestic political implications here are profound because Progressive caucus leaders have stated that the American people have no interest in a Middle East conflict which would erode the nation's global standing and irreparably damage national security, reminding the White House that Congress must be involved in and approve of the offensive use of military force. But here's the brutal reality. Congress has been systematically abdicating its constitutional war powers for decades, allowing presidents of both parties to conduct military operations under increasingly expansive interpretations of existing authorizations for the use of military force. The War Powers Resolution is a dead letter. The authorization for use of military force passed after 9/11 has been stretched to justify operations in countries that had nothing to do with those attacks, and there is no meaningful check on executive branch militarism anymore. Democracy is hollowed out when it comes to questions of war and peace. The economic dimensions of this cannot be ignored because the United States approved a $230 million aid package for Lebanon's security forces after the state vowed to disarm non-state armed groups including Hezbollah, which sounds generous until you understand this is classic imperial management, providing just enough resources to compel compliance with American strategic objectives while ensuring dependency and maintaining leverage. Analysts note it would have been wiser to wait until the Lebanese armed forces actually took steps against Hezbollah's weapons before approving aid, as U.S. financial support underscores Washington's tentative approval of Beirut's early moves. But if Lebanon expects continued American financial assistance, it must recognize that half measures will not suffice. This is aid as coercion, development assistance as geopolitical weapon, the World Bank and IMF model applied to security sector reform. What makes this moment particularly dangerous is the regional context that could turn a Lebanon operation into something far more catastrophic. The direct military confrontation between Israel and Iran stands out among 2024's worrying developments, with dangerous escalations from brazen Israeli assassinations in Damascus, Tehran, and Beirut to barrages of Iranian missiles launched at Israel, bringing the question of Tehran's nuclear capability to the fore as Iran has advanced its program while debating whether to cross the nuclear threshold. We're one miscalculation away from a regional conflagration that could involve nuclear weapons, that could disrupt global energy supplies, that could kill millions, and American officials are casually discussing military operations that would almost certainly escalate tensions with Iran. At the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, they've long warned about Iran's decades-long strategy to drive American forces out of the Middle East, surround Israel with terrorist proxy armies, and destroy the world's only Jewish state, noting that in 2015, Iran's supreme leader vowed to destroy Israel by 2040. This is the ideological framework driving policy. The media's role in normalizing this discourse cannot be overstated, because what we just watched in that clip is not being framed as the scandal it should be. Imagine if a Secretary of State casually acknowledged that military action against another country was being discussed without any authorization from Congress, without any public debate about the costs and consequences, without any serious consideration of alternatives, and the response from major news outlets was to treat it as just another day in foreign policy business. Decades of biased coverage have helped bring us to this moment of normalized anti-Palestinian racism and dehumanization, with the past months of Israel's war exposing Western media's misuse of journalistic ethics and standards and disregard for Palestinian lives, confirmed by quantitative studies of U.S. cable news and print news coverage. The same media dynamics that enabled Iraq are operating now. Here's what should terrify anyone paying attention to Lebanese internal politics. While Hezbollah's Shia constituents see Washington's plan as an affront to Lebanon's sovereignty, Hezbollah's detractors see it as an historic opportunity to weaken the group's influence over the state. Some fear that Washington's plan could pit the Lebanese army against Hezbollah while fueling tensions between Lebanon's different sects. This is Iraq all over again. This is Libya all over again. This is the playbook of exploiting internal divisions to justify external intervention. Consequences be damned for the people who actually have to live with the resulting chaos. Squeezed between demands of the U.S. and Israel on one hand, and concerns of Lebanon's Shia population on the other, the army is walking a tightrope and must walk it fast if they want to avert another war. America is creating the conditions for civil war. The humanitarian situation that would result from what Graham is proposing should be front and center in any discussion of this policy, but it's barely mentioned because Palestinian and Lebanese lives are simply not valued in American foreign policy discourse, the way Israeli or American lives are. During 2024, the Gaza war unraveled into one of the world's biggest humanitarian crises as Israel's ongoing offensive led to dwindling stocks of food, shelter, and medicine, while continued bombardment pushed the death toll past 45,500, many of them women and children. The Gaza war spilled into Lebanon in 2024, sparking mass exodus from the already beleaguered nation, with thousands of civilians killed as Israel dramatically escalated attacks, targeting what it says were Hezbollah strongholds. A military campaign to forcibly disarm Hezbollah would be exponentially worse. What Rubio's comments reveal is not ignorance or lack of planning, but the deliberate ambiguity that allows for escalation without accountability, the kind of strategic vagueness that lets administrations slide into wars without ever making a clear decision that could be held up to democratic scrutiny. He says he's not ruling anything out for the future. He validates the goal of neutralizing Hezbollah. He distances himself just enough to maintain plausible deniability while leaving all options on the table. This is how wars start in the 21st century. Not with declarations and grand speeches, but with gradual escalation, mission creep, and the normalization of military options, until one day you wake up and realize American troops are fighting and dying in another Middle Eastern country, and nobody can quite explain how we got there, or what the exit strategy is. The parallels to Vietnam should also be invoked here, because this is exactly how that catastrophe unfolded. Gradual escalation, advisory missions becoming combat operations, proxy forces being armed and trained, assurances that victory was just around the corner, and then decades of bloodshed that accomplished nothing except demonstrating the limits of American military power. 9 months after the Hamas assault on southern Israel, the Middle East remained in an extremely volatile, fragile state, with the Gaza war continuing without resolution, and growing threats of even more devastating conflict breaking out between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, compounded by uncertainty over elections in the US, Israel, and Iran, along with growing political and societal divisions. This is the tinderbox into which Graham and Rubio want to throw matches. The ultimate question that every American needs to ask themselves right now is this: what is the actual U.S. national security interest in disarming Hezbollah, worth potentially thousands of American casualties, tens of thousands of Lebanese casualties, regional war with Iran, disruption of global energy markets, massive defense spending increases, and the creation of another generation of people in the Middle East who have every reason to hate the United States? Because when you strip away the rhetoric about Iranian proxies and threats to Israel and regional stability, that's the calculation being made, and the people making it have been wrong about every major foreign policy question for the last quarter century. They were wrong about Iraq. They were wrong about Libya. They were wrong about Afghanistan. They were wrong about Syria. And they're wrong about this. This is not about opposing Hezbollah's ideology or defending everything the organization has done. This is about recognizing that military intervention to forcibly reshape Lebanese politics will produce catastrophic consequences that dwarf whatever problems it claims to solve. This is about understanding that the logic of endless war, of viewing the Middle East as a chessboard for great power competition, of subordinating human rights and democracy to geopolitical goals, has failed spectacularly every single time it's been tried. This is about demanding that American foreign policy finally learn something from the last 50 years of disastrous interventions and embrace diplomacy, multilateralism, and respect for sovereignty instead of bombs and regime change. What we witnessed in that clip was not a gaffe. It was not an accident. It was the mask slipping on American empire, the casual acknowledgement that military force against sovereign nations is always on the menu, always an option to be considered, and the only question is timing and political will. The tragedy is that millions of people will suffer if this policy is pursued, and the people making these decisions will face no consequences, will write their memoirs about tough choices and fog of war, will be lauded as elder statesmen at think tanks funded by defense contractors, while the bodies pile up and another generation of Americans comes home broken from another unwinnable war that never should have been fought. That's the real scandal here. That's what should have us in the streets demanding accountability, and that's what the casual shrug from Marco Rubio actually represents: the death of any pretense that American foreign policy is about anything other than maintaining imperial dominance regardless of the human cost.